Hi, welcome back to Wild Geese. I'm your host, Anna. And this week, I want to talk about critical thinking. And I feel like I've seen a lot of things about critical thinking, anti-intellectualism, yada, yada. People saying, nobody wants to think critically anymore. And I actually have to disagree with that. I think people really desperately do want to think critically. I don't know if that's just a product of me having the audience that I do, but the people that I'm coming in contact with the most on the internet are people that do genuinely want to engage with things deeply. Not people that are like numbing themselves with a bunch of AI slop every single day or like turning on Cocomelon and drooling or something. Like, I think that that is kind of the image of society that's put out there a lot right now. But I actually have seen a lot of resistance to the rise in anti-intellectualism happening. Like all over social media lately, there's been that trend of creating your own personal curriculum. Basically, what people have been doing is if they're interested in a topic, they will go and like fully build out a course schedule with books that they're going to read, classes that they're going to take, final projects that they're going to do about that topic. I think people are really craving and fighting for a bit of critical thinking. And I won't say that that's true across the board, but for the people that I'm talking to, I believe that's true. Speaking of creating your own personal curriculum and resisting the rise of anti-intellectualism, thank you to today's sponsor, Brilliant. Brilliant helps you become a better thinker and problem solver with thousands of visual, interactive lessons in math, science, programming, and data analysis. And speaking of critical thinking, hot topic for today, Brilliant helps you build your critical thinking skills with things like problem solving, not memorizing. I don't know about you, but I always had this issue in school where I felt like I was having to memorize the formula instead of actually understand the why and the how behind the solution. Brilliant works to bridge that gap. You can use Brilliant either at home or on the go with fun, hands-on lessons that you can access through the desktop or the mobile app. I've been taking Brilliant's scientific thinking course while I'm on the subway lately, and let me tell you, it's a much better way to pass the time than doom scrolling on TikTok. Kind of side note, but something about the sound effects that they use makes playing the games kind of addicting. To learn for free on Brilliant, you can scan the QR code on screen or click the link in the episode description. Brilliant's also given my viewers 20% off of an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited access to everything on Brilliant. What I want to talk specifically about, though, is the confusion that I'm seeing between critical thinking and moral policing. Eliza Day has a TikTok where she puts it very beautifully. She says, to think critically about something is to understand its deeper themes, its implications, its broader context, both within the creator's life and within the larger moment in society. It's to understand the difference between the artistic expression and the public reception. It's not deciding whether I think this thing is good and right and pure or is evil and wrong and never should have been made in the first place. That's censorship. And the issue with that is that as soon as you're leaning into that territory, who is deciding what has a right to exist and be expressed versus who is deciding what is bad and evil and should never exist and should be suppressed or eliminated? And I've definitely been privy to some of this very binary thinking in my comment sections, and it usually manifests in a way that feels like a grasp for control. And I wrote a Substack essay this past week called Some of You Are Engaging in Cop Behavior. I started the essay by equating it to my experience in the service industry. Working as a waitress, there are definitely some disturbing power dynamics that happen between the customer and the waiter. In the name of the customer is always right. And I said, as a freelancer, the day-to-day power grabs look different but feel oddly similar. I often wake up feeling like I'm in trouble. Server nightmares have been replaced with an obsessive need to check comment sections to see if I'm being yelled at. I'm trying to squash a cloud of resentment that's growing over my head because it feels like some people want me to feel this way. I've been writing just as much but withholding a lot more because I'm disturbed by the way certain strangers on the internet police my every move. I know they're not just doing it to me. Some people, albeit a fringe subset of my audience, act like they own me because they clicked subscribe. I'm struck by the depth of the police state. When I heard that term in the past, I always pictured literal surveillance cameras and face identification software. Now I see the way individuals take it upon themselves to monitor and enforce their will onto strangers. I'm not just talking about cancel culture, yawn, although that's part of it. It feels more insidious than that. People engage in cop behavior without realizing it. I suspect they're confusing binary thinking for critical thinking. Even further, they're conflating moral judgments with activism. I've had total strangers say they're disappointed when I step out of line with their expectations. I have to wonder what makes them think I ever appointed them to a position of power over me in the first place. Whether it's in the service industry or the online space, I'm noticing that some people seem like they're itching for the opportunity to punish someone. And I want to make it clear, this is not just about hate comments or cancel culture. I feel like those conversations are very played out. But I think that this specific moral policing has broader implications than just what it might do to my psychological health. So we can talk about what this moral policing actually looks like in action, where I think it's coming from, and then I want to talk about the skill of assessing context, media literacy, and the art of critique, because really it is an art. I think it would be easy to go down this line of conversation and kind of end in a conclusion that's like, stop criticizing me. And that's not at all what I'm trying to say. If you disagree with things that I say, it is totally fine for you to voice those opinions. But there is a way to think critically that allows those critical thoughts to actually deepen the conversation instead of halt it completely. There's a difference between being a critical person who bases their entire personality around what they hate and falls into this like almost authoritarian devotion to certainty, and the person who uses critical thinking and the art of critique as a way to crack the world wide open. So let's talk about what I even mean when I say moral policing. Usually it starts with a person approaching me, or any other person on the internet really, but use me as an example, approaching me with a level of high suspicion. And it makes sense that that suspicion is there, especially as the fabric of trust is literally being eroded in real time because of things like Sora and deepfakes that are getting more and more realistic and, like false information all over the internet. Of course, there's a level of suspicion, right? But then what happens is that when something is said that rubs up against someone's moral understanding of the world, people tend to switch into very stark binary thinking. And sometimes this means they go into investigation mode trying to sniff out a crime. But it's usually in those true crime stories that you hear where the cop is trying to coerce someone into a confession for a crime they didn't commit. That's usually the vibe, is the person has already labeled me in their mind as bad. So now nothing I say or do can convince them otherwise. And when I say good and bad, I also see this being used interchangeably with smart and ignorant. So if a hint of my ignorance slips through, which there's a good amount of ignorance in me, I'm a 27-year-old woman, I don't know everything. But if a piece of that slips through, someone who's engaging in moral policing would then go on to think conspiratorially or make baseless accusations, even tone policing, the classic tone policing, right? I've had people read into micro expressions that I've made before. And sometimes it just jumps straight to punishment. And online, what quote-unquote punishment can look like is just harassment, It's being blocked and then creating a new profile and coming back in order to teach me a lesson. Sometimes it's a little less intense than that, though, and it's just people paying such close attention to your every move and then acting as if they should have jurisdiction over your personal decisions. In my essay I wrote, "Here's what I wish I could say to these people. You have become an extension of the police state you claim to be against. The depth of my anger towards these grabs at control feel amplified right now because we desperately need to focus. For the most part, the people in my comment section are smart people. They're people who care deeply about others. That's why they're critical and exacting. But labeling the mundane, decontextualized actions of strangers as good and bad is one step away from in-group, out-group thinking and carceral punishments. It might feel harmless. You could even delude yourself into thinking it's helpful, but it's misplaced energy distracting you from the cause of liberation for all people. We do not free each other by locking strangers in a moral purity contest." I listened to an interview with the late poet Andrea Gibson. When asked whether they believe in good people versus bad people, they said, "No, I don't believe in good and bad people. The definition for myself for a long time is, are you trying? Are you trying to be kind? Are you trying to be generous? Are you trying to make the world more beautiful?" And I say trying because I have experiences of times in my life where I've tried to be kind and I couldn't be. And I think what's frustrating about these interactions is that I'm not willing to just pass this off as people trolling and leaving hate comments and whatever. I don't know. If I see a hate comment and it's just so clearly an incel, I'm like, all right, delete. That literally does not enter my consciousness at all. But when I can tell that it is a person who is genuinely trying, they think they're contributing something, and we all desperately want to be contributing something good right now. But these are ineffective tactics. And frankly, it's a slippery slope down the alt-right pipeline. You cannot assert your will over strangers. And if we're going to talk about anti-intellectualism, I think we also need to talk about intellectualism being used as a cudgel. Most of the time when people have behaved this way with me, it's because I didn't know something. And when I don't know something, so often people don't see it as being enough just to tell me the thing that I don't know. They then think they need to punish me for not knowing it. And Twitchy Witch on TikTok actually talks about this phenomena pretty succinctly. She says, in equating good and evil with knowledge and ignorance, you haven't actually dissolved the binary. You've just replaced the moral binary with knowledge is good and ignorance is evil. The idea that ignorance is the opposite of knowledge, it isn't. Ignorance is what shapes knowledge. Everything you know or think you know is held together by everything that you don't know. And there are obviously many issues with thinking this way, but a big one is that it's a personal trap as well. If you think knowledge is good and ignorance is evil, then you're submitting yourself to a lifetime of evil because you will always be ignorant about something. We are all approaching everything, every piece of media, every book that we read, every show that we watch, every conversation that we have with different layers of context behind us. And this isn't just meant to lecture people who are engaging in this behavior, although part of it is cathartic. The comments that I've gotten just in this essay have helped me unpack the nuance in this conversation. And that, again, is the magic of us all meeting here on the internet. We can help each other see the layers and things. We can help each other speak more truly. We can help each other express more deeply, or we can decide to shut all of that down in the sake of moral purity. Someone who read this essay sent me a little blurb about a purity spiral. And a purity spiral is a theory which argues for the existence of a form of groupthink in which it becomes more beneficial to hold certain views than to not hold them, and more extreme views are rewarded, while expressing doubt, nuance, or moderation is punished, a process called moral outbidding. It is argued that this feedback loop leads to members competing to demonstrate the zealotry or purity of their views. A purity spiral is argued to occur when a community's primary focus becomes implementing a single value that has no upper limit, and where that value does not have an agreed interpretation. And that point about values not having an agreed upon interpretation reminds me of a Substack essay I read by Hannah Glenn that, as I was reading it, I was like, did I write this? It sounded so much like the original journal entry that prompted this episode. It's called, Maybe We're All So Worried About Getting in Trouble Because We Keep Trying to Get Each Other in Trouble. And she says, I'm worried I'm going to get in big trouble, but I don't really know what exactly for. I just have an overwhelming feeling that one day the penny is going to drop and everyone is going to turn around and yell at me. I check my emails with bated breath. When I go out for drinks, I spend the next day combing over the things I said. In any other era, I think I'd be considered paranoid. In this era, I think my mindset is actually fairly common. She goes on to talk about the way that we're displaying our lives to others and the appetite that people seem to have for public shame, citing things like the Coldplay Jumbotron cheating scandal thing that happened, West Elm Caleb. I mean, it's a different thing every single day. And she says, I think we often find comfort in the idea that it's moral retribution, simply consequences of their actions. But what if we get it wrong or out of context? Or what if our ideas of what's considered morally wrong in society change? After all, morality is subjective and shifts all the time. What was considered good in Roman times, in the Middle Ages, in the 50s, in the 80s, even in the 2000s, is all completely different now. Who knows what the world looks like in 10 years and 20 years? And I thought that was a really interesting point to take seriously, because what is considered quote-unquote moral to us now is subject to change. Book burnings, mass censorship, those things start on an interpersonal level that's based on shaming the people around you for not knowing the same things as you or believing the same things as you or having the same cultural context as you. There were multiple people who commented on my essay saying that they haven't put their work out there in years because they're afraid of this behavior. And we have to seriously question how many people's expression and imagination we are suppressing when we value condemnation over exploration. MJ Mays on Substack posted a note that said, someone replied to my latest post respectfully requesting that I stop cursing in my writing because it's offensive and uncool, and they don't need that language in their inbox. And it's weird to expect creators to bend to your preferences rather than taking on the responsibility of curating a feed that you actually approve of. I think sometimes people can get confused with the boundary conversation and start to look at boundaries as this set of rules that everyone else should be abiding by, when really I think boundaries are more about a set of expectations for yourself of like, if this thing happens, here's how I will respond. And I don't know, I guess this is a good time for me to just set a boundary, which is an expectation for my own conduct. I don't want to become a cop to my comment section. I want you guys to feel free to say your opinion, say what you mean. But what I expect from myself is that when this moral policing behavior begins, I will block the person doing the moral policing, and that will be the end of the conversation. But please know, if you leave a public comment, I'm at liberty to respond publicly. I will never call out anybody by name. I will never try to send a swarm of people to bully somebody. That I never want it to be like that. But I don't know, sometimes there are discussion starters in the comments. And I want to use a question that somebody asked about the last episode that I think is an interesting way to jump into the media literacy conversation. Someone was basically saying that they enjoyed the last episode, but they were skeptical about one of the sources that I used and asked, how are you sure the author writes from a good place with respect? And my response to that covers two really important things that I think guide us into the media literacy realm of this conversation, which is the context behind this show itself and the relation I have with these sources. The context of this show is that I am one 27-year-old woman alone in my room that does not have a team of people behind me making sure that every source that I pull from is coming from 100% ideological purity, whatever that even means. I am doing everything in my power with the resources at my disposal to pull from quality sources. But I think the fact that I'm doing this and I'm not salaried under a media institution could open up a whole can of worms and an entire conversation about the devaluing and defunding of certain journalistic pursuits, things like investigative journalism and cultural critiques, things that used to be highly coveted and supported monetarily. What I actually mean here is that there used to be a lot more journalists that were supported institutionally, and I just saw a really interesting video that was talking about how institutional trust is collapsing in favor of individual trust. So now what you have are these huge CEOs that are paying thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars in order to build personal brands so that they as individuals can be trusted. That there are individuals building individual brands that actually represent these huge institutions. I can tell you right now, that's not who I am. With that being said, I am not going to sit here and say that I am not supported monetarily by this podcast. I'm part of the YouTube Partner Program, so I get some money from ad revenue from that. I also get money from brand partnerships, but that does not come out to a full-time salary, and even if it did, my point about not having a team would still stand, for now at least. So that's some context that I think it's important to be approaching the show with. Another piece of context that I think is really important for people to understand is that just because a source is included, that does not imply a 100% agreement between me and that other author. To put it into perspective, when you're in school and you're writing essays, is it your job to engage with the text and connect disparate ideas? Or is it your job to comb through the ideological background of every single source that you include in order to ensure that it falls in alignment with your professor's moral understanding of the world? And I'm not saying ideological background is never relevant. Sometimes it would be important context for the conversation. Sometimes it would be a distraction from it. Bottom line is, I am not trying to cultivate a cult-like sense of trust and certainty in everything that I say from you, right? I've been transparent about the place that I speak from, and I will continue to be. Anytime that I think about what I hope anyone gets out of this podcast, it's that they have a closer relationship to their own curiosity. Not that they walk away with some revelatory moment where their life is changed and they've finally found the truth of the world or something. I can't give that to anyone, and I won't pretend to. There's an illustration of a hierarchy of thinking styles that comes from a book by Adam Grant called Think Again. I have not read this book. So just to, illustrate the point that I just made, I don't know that I would back every single thing that Adam Grant said in this book. I just saw this pyramid and I was like, that's an interesting way to think about it. I'll pop a picture of it on a screen, but if you're listening, it's a pyramid that goes from bottom to top. Cult leader, politician, contrarian, critical thinker, and learner at the top. The cult leader thinks they're always right and treats their own thoughts as gospel. The politician says they're wrong, we're right, preaching your side's gospel and prosecuting the other side's. The contrarian says you're all wrong. They find flaws in other people's arguments, but they're blind to the limitations of their own. And then the critical thinker says that might be wrong. They're engaging with diverse sources of information and questioning their credibility. And then finally at the top, the learner says, I might be wrong. They surround themselves with people who challenge their thought process and change their mind in the face of stronger logic and evidence. I'll be honest, I have some conflicting thoughts about how I feel about this being put in a pyramid and hierarchy form, but I thought it was interesting to consider. All of my sources are linked in the episode descriptions because I want y'all to go and engage with them and decide for yourselves what you think about them. I imagine that if any of you decided to read every single one of the sources that I put in these episodes and then make something for yourself, you might then go and write an entirely different essay with entirely different conclusions. And that, to me, is the fun part of this. But these specific pieces of context about who I am, where I'm coming from, how I'm being paid, that kind of thing, are all answers to questions put forward by the National Association for Media Literacy Education. These are part of the list of key questions that they put forward for media literacy. And I'm just going to run down these really quick. These are questions that we should all be asking for pieces of media that we want to be well informed about. So when you're analyzing media messages, you should ask who made this, when was it made, who paid for this, what does this tell me about this topic, what are the sources of information, what is left out that might be important to know, what techniques are used and why, and how do the techniques communicate the message. And then when you're evaluating media messages, you should ask, how credible is this and how do I know? Is this fact, opinion, or something else? Can I trust this source to tell me the truth about this topic? Who might benefit from this message and who might be harmed by it? What does this make me feel and how do my emotions influence my interpretation of this? How might different people understand this message differently? Is this message good for me or people like me? And then when you're acting on media messages, it says that you should ask, what actions might I take in response to this message? How might I participate productively? What do I do with this information? And how do I get other people to act based on what I created? So given all of these questions, it makes total sense to me that someone would ask, how do you know that the source that you were pulling from is coming from a quote unquote good place? Basically, what you're asking is, can I trust this source to tell me the truth about this topic? What I will tell you is that I will never include a source that I don't believe that that is true with. The problem is, if you're skeptical about the source, you're probably skeptical of it because you're coming into it with a different context than I am. So that's kind of the trade-off when we trade institutional trust for individual trust. If I'm one person and I'm only coming from one context, then I can't really take into account whatever makes you skeptical of this source. I can only take into account what I know. And it's tricky when you're consuming media that's filtered through a large institution. That large institution might have monetary incentives to feed you propaganda. And while I, as an individual, don't have monetary incentives to feed you propaganda, I'm just an individual. So I can only be working at the highest level of my knowledge at that moment. And that, to me, is where the real opportunity lies if we allow ourselves to see it that way. It can be left at a fair criticism of the source, or you can take that friction and go and make something that contends with it. If you decided to do that, then you would have to go on your own journalistic pursuit to answer all of the questions that I just read. And in doing so, I believe that it would become clear fairly quickly that things like media literacy, true, solid media literacy, and artistic critique, especially in the age of AI slop, can be full-time jobs. Because to really truly understand where a source is coming from, if your question is, how do we know that that source is coming from a good place? That question involves a whole string of investigation. You need to trace back a money trail if there is one. Is this person being paid to say what they're saying? Or is it of their own volition? What is the personal context that this person is coming from? What prejudices do they have? In order to figure that out, you would need to go and interview them, interview the people in their lives. That information is not always readily available in the text. You would need to comb through all of the sources that they're pulling from in order to investigate for biases. And this work is culturally important. It's time-consuming. But if you're going to have a damning opinion about something in order to keep your own integrity intact, it should probably be well-backed. And this brings me to the work of a critic. Priya Jain has a great essay on Substack where she's talking about the death of criticism and how, because we don't value that work anymore, fruitless online hot takes have come and overwhelmed the space and driven us to this place of bad faith debate instead of opening up the floor for a larger conversation. She frames this issue around the movie Ratatouille and how Ratatouille paints the food critic as this miserable person who didn't find happiness until he left the life of a critic. She says the critic, the movie asserts, is necessarily at odds with the process of creation, whereas I saw the critic's job as an extension of the creative act. Criticism isn't antithetical to creation. Edgar Allan Poe was a critic, so was T.S. Eliot and Walt Whitman. On the contrary, criticism is necessary to it. Good, engaged, deeply felt criticism takes that piece of art and fixes it to the firmament. A critic pins a song or a film or a movie onto the still wet spiderweb of culture and tells us not only what it means to consume art and food and media, but what it means to be alive here, now, in this place and time. She uses Gia Tolentino's article in The Cut all about Elizabeth Gilbert and her new memoir. If you're not up to speed, Elizabeth Gilbert is the author of Eat, Pray, Love. She's also done a lot of really popular TED Talks, and she wrote Big Magic. Well, she's coming out with a memoir that is quite controversial because it details some very questionable, complex things that happened in her past relationship with her lover that died of cancer. Before the memoir was released, Gia Tolentino came and wrote a whole piece in The Cut that wasn't just a criticism of the new memoir. It was a whole deep dive into Elizabeth Gilbert herself, going all the way back to the beginning of her career in order to make a critical assessment of the new book. Priya was basically saying that they were interested in writing something similar before this essay came out in the cut, and they were glad that Gia wrote it because they themselves were not staffed as a full-time culture writer, and they simply didn't have the bandwidth to afford that to the piece. So Priya was excited by Gia's article, thought it was really well done, but this is what she says. She says, where once it might have launched a cascade of critical essays, each linking to each other, referencing each other, building, as it were, a cultural conversation, reckoning with the phenomenon that is Elizabeth Gilbert, the conversation just kind of collapsed. Sure, there were a lot of takes on Notes and Threads and Blue Sky and whatever else has come to lap up the dregs of what was once Twitter, but these were cannibalistic. By form and design, the hot take is designed to reduce, where a conversation is meant to expand. And it's interesting because I've had a couple of people call back to or comment on past episodes where I've quoted Liz Gilbert. Now that all of this has come out, literally people have pulled out that kind of weaponized saying of like, you should really employ some critical thinking because I've quoted Liz Gilbert in the past. And it just strikes me that arguments like that try to flatten someone's entire body of work as like this invalid thing that anyone who was critically thinking would not look twice at because they disagree with some of the things that Liz Gilbert has said or done, versus something like Gia Tolentino's essay holds space for context and nuance and doesn't have to agree with Elizabeth Gilbert in order to afford her the kind of conversation that I believe any writer or artist putting themselves out there deserves. Gia provided the kind of reflection on the work that allowed readers to walk away and draw their own conclusions, instead of just looking at them sideways and saying that they're not thinking critically for reading the writer in the first place. All that to say, being a person who has big opinions about things is not a bad thing. A big part of critical thinking is using the context that you have to draw conclusions. But what's not critical thinking is taking that conclusion that you've come to and deciding that it's the end-all be-all, becoming so stuck in it that it becomes absolute truth to you and any new information can't move you. That's where you get into binary thinking. That's where you get people saying, oh, well, this isn't true for me, so it's not true for anyone. What I'm not advocating for, though, is refusing to draw conclusions for the sake of being quote-unquote rational or moderate. When it comes to big issues, sitting on the fence doesn't move the needle. So if you're a person who wants to hone your opinion and it's exciting to you to think about refining it, it might be a good time to look towards critics and find some that you trust in order to see how one opinion can lead you down a rabbit hole. And when I say find critics that you trust, I do not mean find critics that you agree with every single point that they've ever made. I mean that you trust that they're acting from integrity, they're talking about pieces of media that you're also interested in, even if tangentially, and they're not resorting to character assassinations. I've seen a good bit of that on Substack, and it's like quite disturbing to me. I saw something that was touting itself as a quote-unquote critique of Ocean Vuong, but really it was just purely character assassination, like calling this author illiterate, just absolutely ridiculous stuff. And that's where discernment really needs to come in when you're finding critics that you trust, because they might be tearing apart something that you also want to tear apart, and then it just becomes like a feedback loop of cruelty instead of anything actually productive. Ayan Artin is a critic that I trust and that I have quoted many times on this podcast, and they have a Substack essay called How to Be a Critic, which I definitely recommend going to check out. They say, I know it doesn't seem like it, but there is an artistry to what us critics do. There are ethical parameters we must function within, basic principles we must follow in order to separate our opinions from those of the average tweeter. They then go on to talk about their process in forming a critique, and I think it's really fascinating, even if you have no interest in being a critic, which I definitely didn't when I first found this essay. I think it's fascinating to think about what the process is that goes into it, and seems to be a guide more generally for mindful consumption, even if you don't care to make a formal critique. They say some work will elicit an immediate reaction from you. That reaction will not always be critically accurate or fair. Food critics will often visit a restaurant thrice before they make their judgment. I function the same way now. I'll do an honest first watch or read, notebook and pen on the other side of the room, where I let the story swallow me up. The second visit is technically my first critical watch or listen. This time, I note everything down. I'll write a skeleton draft immediately and leave it alone, even if it's just for the rest of the day. When a little time has passed, I revisit the work and see if my observations still ring true. I cannot tell you how many times I've had to alter a draft after a rewatch. Sometimes all it takes is a second try when you aren't distracted from your phone or in a foul mood post-workout. Ask questions of the work. Tilt it around and see if you spot the same blemishes. And I really liked that point. In fact, the other day I was having a conversation with somebody where we were talking about pieces of media from childhood that we've come back around to, and each time that we come back around to it, we have like a completely different takeaway than we did the time before. And part of this is also just a form of respect for the artist, like due diligence. I am having such a hard time saying those words. Due diligence for the artist. Like, I don't know. Last week, the last episode, there were people that were making what they thought were counterpoints that I did touch on in the episode. And it was frustrating to me because I was like, what you're doing is you're making it immediately clear to me that you didn't actually watch what I created and you responded to it before watching what I made. Like, that's just kind of disrespectful. But I think beyond respecting the person that created the thing that you're consuming, interacting with media this way teaches you how to look at the same thing over and over and over again and see deeper and deeper and deeper meaning behind it. Ayan has so many great tips in this essay, but one thing that they say is that we're in the midst of a curiosity crisis. And so many people are like writing think pieces about films when they don't even know how it was filmed or who wrote it. And this essay just really illustrates how there's so much context behind every single piece of media. And when you really take time to parse through it, that's a gift to yourself and to the people in your community. Someone named Christiana on TikTok has a video all about how they're trying to create a curriculum that can kind of bridge the gap between generations and cultural context and highlight the fact that everyone has a different type of knowledge that they can contribute to a whole versus the binary thinking behind adult smart, kid dumb, right? Children have a very different lens on the world. They're seeing everything for the first time. So that perspective is valuable. They say our job as facilitators of knowledge and learners ourselves is to be developing mechanisms, questions, curiosities that we can revisit 1,000 times. So it's not about one really great lesson. It's about one compelling interest that we can come back to the interest and go deeper. So she uses the example of a quote unquote children's book that actually covers some pretty serious themes. And she started reading this book with her child when her child was 3. And first it was just like looking at the pictures and trying to understand the pictures. And then it was like slowly learning the words and then learning the meaning behind the words and how those are all just layers of knowledge that even she as an adult were coming back around to. And each time that she would pick up the book, she would find something new. She equated it to a swimming pool where the swimming pool has multiple depths and the learners get to decide what depth of the pool they want to be in, but they're all in the same pool. They said that's what learning should be like. I want to create public types of learning where an elder and a kid could meet up and see the same question, the same inspiration of learning, and be able to exchange information and learning regardless of how old they are. Part of liberation is the reclamation that we are all swimming in the same pool of knowledge, and we all have something to teach one another about what's possible and of interest and curious about whatever it is, and then it's actually more healthy for us to look at information and say, there's a way to make this information accessible to every single type of learner. And it was interesting hearing this because I think the internet already kind of is that public meeting place where we've got kids and elders, we've got people of all different cultural contexts, everything coming together in one place, and we could use it as that place to exchange information and share our learnings. But instead, what we have is this curiosity crisis that Ayan Artin was talking about, and I think that that is at least partly attributed to people confusing critical thinking with binary thinking, when actually binary thinking is the thing that shuts down your critical thinking. I'm honestly so grateful for things like digital gardening for this reason, because practices like that allow me to face my knee-jerk reactions to things and analyze them, go deeper into rabbit holes, and I can do that without spewing hot takes that don't take the artist's humanity into account. And to close out this episode, I'm going to quote one of my new favorite movies, Before Sunrise. I just recently watched it and I loved it. I'll have to do a critical deep dive into exactly why I loved it at some point soon, I'm sure. But the character Celine says, if there's any kind of magic in this world, it must be in the attempt of understanding someone sharing something. I know it's almost impossible to succeed, but who really cares? The answer must be in the attempt. I will try to understand you if you try to understand me, and I think that's all I've got this week. I will see you in 2 weeks, and in 2 weeks, I am committed to talking about something stupid. Because I felt like this was a very serious episode, so I'm ready to get silly again. Talk to you soon. Bye.